I think one of the really underexamined aspects of our contemporary situation is this sort of move away from what was once a broad consensus within America and within China between the political elite and the tech elite. There was this, as I call it in the book, a Silicon Valley consensus. The idea being that effectively, what was good for the American tech sector was good for American geopolitics as well, good for American national strategy. So if the US platform companies wanted to go out and dominate global infrastructure and dominate these global markets, that served American interest really well. With this convergence of beliefs about the role of technology within the world, the way in which it furthered American power, geopolitical power, economic power, all of these sorts of things. Now, in China, you get a similar sort of consensus, which isn't so much based upon this international projection of power, but is instead based upon national economic development. And this particularly starts to emerge after 2008 with the financial crisis, when the sort of traditional growth sectors of the Chinese economy are starting to really stall and flag. And there's this turn towards the tech sector as the new growth area for the Chinese economy. And so you get in the mid-2000s, famous policies like the Made in China 2025 policy, but also really, I think, important things like the Internet Plus initiative and the so-called Big Fund, which is massive amount of money devoted towards building up semiconductors and various other high-tech industries within China. And within that sort of broad parameter of how do we get economic growth and economic development growing, the Chinese state basically says to Chinese platforms, go and do what you want. Your growth benefits economic growth more broadly, and it therefore benefits our political and social legitimacy as a ruling regime. So again, you get this convergence of interests between the tech elite and the political elite, and the tech elite in both countries are effectively given free rein to go and do what they want, to follow, in particular, their capitalist interest, wherever that may take them. Now, I think this has changed since the rise of the trade war. And both in the US and in China, you've seen this hegemonic system which once held, this hegemonic agreement, you've seen it start to break down, and it hasn't been replaced by anything yet. Instead, what we're seeing is the emergence of new sort of competing fractions of elite interests, which are struggling at the moment to try and gain this dominant hegemonic position to be able to build a new sort of consensus. It's unfinished at the moment, though. In the US, you have the rise of what you might call the tech right, or you might think about it as you've got big tech on the one hand, but you've also got little tech in the sense of things like venture capital, things like startups, things like the defense tech industry. These are companies which may have billions of dollars in revenue, but compared to the Amazons, the Googles, the Microsofts, they are in a completely different league from those big tech companies. The big tech companies, they simply want a return to the neoliberal order, I think. They don't want geopolitical tensions. It's a hindrance for their business. It's a hindrance for their capitalist interests. They would much prefer a smooth order of free trade of goods, services, and data around the world. And they would much rather be able to invest and buy whatever they need and wherever they need. By contrast, this emerging group of the new tech right in the US are very much rejecting that neoliberal idea that to bring China into the global economic order, they'll become liberalized, they'll become good capitalists, and they can be integrated into the world economic system without a conflict. These companies, by contrast, are saying something very different and pushing for something very different. In China, you also have this sort of breakdown. And I think the real big moment for China comes in 2021 with what's been called the tech crackdown. So China had let their platform companies have free rein for a decade or longer in some cases. They were virtually allowed to go and do whatever they wanted. And then in 2021, seemingly out of nowhere, there's a massive crackdown on Alibaba, on Tencent, on a bunch of smaller companies. Suddenly, all these different fines are put on them. Mergers are put into review. Loads of different investigations into these companies. And it was quite a surprise. But I think one of the things that's really interesting when you look back at it now is who wasn't affected by this? What tech companies weren't being cracked down on at the time? And almost universally, what was cracked down on was platform companies. It was not hard tech companies. Hard tech companies like Huawei, companies like SMIC and SME who are building semiconductor manufacturing equipment for China, things like lithography and stuff. Those companies went completely unscathed through the supposed tech crackdown. It wasn't a tech crackdown, it was a platform crackdown, precisely because these companies weren't as focused on the national self-interest that the Chinese government wanted them to be focused on. So what effectively happens here is that in response to this crackdown, companies like Alibaba and Tencent start to focus on what the government has set as the particular focus. And for them at that time, it's self-reliance, tech self-reliance. China's had by that point a few years of Trump trying to block them and Biden trying to block them from key advanced technologies. And China sees now that it needs to, as a matter of national urgency, it needs to have tech self-reliance. So that becomes its focus, and the platform crackdown is a part and parcel of that shift. But you still end up having, in China, this tension between capitalist interests and government interests. There are companies which are more or less beholden to what the government says, that are carrying out the wishes of what the government wants. But a company like Alibaba, for instance, is still very, very capitalist, and they're still seeking after a profit first and foremost. So there are all these tensions that still exist between these companies and between the political elite of China. And again, I don't think any of this has been resolved per se. I think it's an ongoing tension at the moment. So both in the US and in China, that hegemonic order of consensus between the tech elite and the political elite is broken down right now.
We're interested in the topic of resistance or of alternative political projects that might steer this future of AI differently. Your book doesn't have much room to explore this question because the future really is being shaped by elites in the main at the level of geoeconomics and the vast political economy of AI. But what prospects or considerations do you see for a counter-politics to what's currently emerging?
I think it's really difficult to imagine a proper, meaningful alternative at the moment. In no small part because the scale of resources needed to actually sort of challenge these elite projects is incredibly difficult. I think if we're going to imagine alternatives, it's sort of a multi-pronged strategy that's required. So things like unions pushing it back against AI adoption, which harms workers. I think there can be AI adoption which benefits workers, but there's lots of AI adoption which is not going to be used to benefit workers. It's going to be used to increase surveillance and ultimately to replace them. And of course, I've advocated in the past for more automation, but a key point of my earlier work was always that we need the social system in place to make that sort of automation liberating rather than something which is just putting people into unemployment. So we need to be building up those systems, those social systems which respond to the potential for significantly larger amounts of automation. That may or may not happen with generative AI. If you talk to people in AI labs, they're convinced that it will happen. They're convinced that they will have something like artificial general intelligence within 5 years, usually maximum. We need to be preparing for the potential impacts of that sort of thing. So unions and collectives pushing back against, the sort of bad uses of AI, efforts to build up social systems which respond to the potential impacts, economic and social and political, of artificial intelligence. And then I think another key way to be focusing on this is through stuff like open source and the advocacy for it. Open source so far has been really dominated by Meta. And Meta has, of course, used it as a corporate strategy rather than any sort of progressive political strategy. But there is, I think, a lot of value in the open source movement approach to AI, particularly in developing countries, which may not have a lot of resources to be able to either to develop their own AI systems or to be able to pay OpenAI and Anthropic and whatnot to to sort of keep pace with other economies. So I think open source is crucial for that sort of thing. There's also these sort of AI sovereignty exercises that are going on. The UK has bought into it. The EU is increasingly buying into it as well. A lot of it is basically Jensen Huang from NVIDIA going to all these governments and saying, you need AI sovereignty because I've got loads of chips to sell you. It's very much a sales tactic from him. But at the same time, there is, I think, as Trump and Biden have both made very, very clear, there is a real risk of weaponized interdependence from relying upon US technology. And I think that countries that have the resources to be able to think about building alternatives, which is very few countries in the world, I think that there is something to the AI sovereignty initiative of building alternatives to either the US system or the Chinese ecosystem, and being able to build a sort of proper alternative at that upper level. So all of this is, I think, difficult, highly prone to failure, unlikely to succeed. But they are efforts that I think could be made right now to try and think about how do we try and change the direction of AI in the future, to think about the ways in which it's not just developed, but the ways in which it's implemented, which is, I think, the really crucial question. What are we using AI for? How are we using it? Is it just going to be for military purposes, or can we use it to reduce the working week and things like that? These are, I think, really big live questions at the moment that we need to be fighting for.